Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stream. So the podcast, episode 3, it's all about WrestleMania today. Let me just get it up here. Oh, we have camera issues, give me a second. I apologise about this. This is a very unprofessional. That's fine. I just need to do the transform. There we go, right. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen, but here we are. You can see my TV bit there, but it doesn't matter. Here we are for the podcast, and I hope you're all doing well. This is all about now we're bloody chair. We're supposed to be having a guest today, which will be Brahma, as you will know Brahma. But he has not replied to my message yet. He did say he would join for today's podcast, but he's not joined yet. So, yeah. So yeah, all about WrestleMania today. Let me just put that down a little bit more. That's better. No, it's not. Okay, right, Brahma's ready to join. So let's get it on. Here we go.
Yo, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So I haven't really started yet. I want to get through a few things. Most of it's going to be about us talking about our favourite things about WrestleMania. I'm not going to do any predictions for this year's WrestleMania. I'm going to leave that until the pre-show for each show. So we'll start. I suppose we'll start off with. Well, we might as well start off with what is our favourite WrestleMania. So I'll start, and I'm going to say my favourite WrestleMania. Well, it gives it away because I've got a picture of it on the stream. WrestleMania 25. That would be my favourite WrestleMania, mainly because it had my favourite match pretty much of all time on the pay-per-view, which was, of course, Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels. What a fantastic match that was. And, of course, they did it again at WrestleMania 26. It was brilliant. I enjoyed the whole pay-per-view. I mean, they definitely went all out with it being the 25th anniversary, and it was just a fantastic pay-per-view. The stage was amazing. Just everything about it was epic. Um, so yeah, that would be my favorite WrestleMania. What would you say yours is?
There's so many to choose from.
Of course it is. Yeah.
Um, I mean, look, personally, what do I think was my favorite, and what do I think is the greatest WrestleMania of all time? They're both one and the same. I would say WrestleMania 17. For me, WrestleMania 17 was the pinnacle of. What do I think was my favorite?
Yeah.
It was the pinnacle of the. It was the pinnacle as well as the end of the Attitude Era, but it was almost like wrestling perfection in a way. It was almost the culmination of years of this bitter feud between WWE and WCW going back and forth. WWE obviously coming out and topped that week, buying out their rivals and even having, some of the WCW stars in attendance, including, latest Hall of Fame inductee Stacy Keibler. I mean, everything about that pay per view, in my honest opinion, from the opening match, William Regal versus Chris Jericho, all the way through to the main event, was outstanding. I would say the only blemish on that were two things. Number one, I think, given that the use of Limp Bizkit's My Way was quite prominent in the build up to and during the promos
Hmm.
for the Austin Rock main event, it was a shame that ultimately Limp Bizkit didn't perform on the
Yeah.
night. Of course, Motorhead did. Arguably, it wasn't really their best live performance, but nevertheless, Motorhead did perform on the night. But most importantly, I think it's something we tend to overlook. Austin's heel turn, I think, in the grand scheme of things, didn't really work out. Now, the crowd went crazy because it was a Texas WrestleMania.
Yeah.
Steve Austin won the title, albeit under the worst possible circumstances. I mean, he effectively cheated or played dirty, but
Yeah.
at the same time, that match was made no disqualification. Um, it was made no disqualification at the very last minute.
Yeah.
It also reminds me of a fact that I don't think many people realise, and feel free to correct me if I am wrong here, but it would appear that The Rock never won a world title match at WrestleMania.
Um, that is correct. Yeah, that is a well-known fact, and it's amazing, isn't it, to think that because
The greatest, in my honest opinion, the greatest wrestler of all time didn't have a winning world
well,
title moment.
I was gonna say that. I was gonna say like you know the greatest the greatest wrestler of all time not winning a world championship at WrestleMania. I mean that's just unheard of. I mean it doesn't seem right. I mean, how can we claim that this guy is the greatest wrestler of all time, but yet he didn't win the big one at WrestleMania? But yet he
As
was.
far as I can recall,
But yet he was the great. He is the greatest.
but as far as I can recall, he only ever won the main event on one occasion, and that was when he beat John Cena at WrestleMania 28.
Didn't
I mean,
no,
correct?
because no. I didn't he win? Wasn't his final match with Austin the main event, and he won that?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't the main event of
Was it
WrestleMania.
not?
No.
No. Well, there you go. Then I'm wrong about that. I thought it was. I thought they were main eventage, but every single WrestleMania they had a match on.
And the great thing about WrestleMania 17, there was also, and something that we've never really had since, the gimmick battle royal when you had the likes of Doink the Clown, Sergeant Slaughter, the Gobbledygooker, Iron Sheik, IRS. Actually, I don't know if IRS was there. I'd have to go back and see that. But yeah, Jim Cornette, Brother Love. It's something that I wish they could bring back every now and again.
Mm,
But it's almost as if that show had everything. You had, the superstars from the past in the gimmick battle royal. You had the
mm,
young up and comers of the Attitude Era. You had obviously WCW superstars, coming over. It was, yeah, it was the epitome of the Attitude Era. I think the following year's WrestleMania wasn't that bad, albeit they made the wrong choice as to what should have closed out the show. Now, I don't think anybody anticipated for one moment Hulk Hogan was going to get the reception he got in the Toronto Skydome.
mm.
And I'll be brutally honest with you, I didn't think it was going to be a good match because I was still skeptical as to whether or not Hogan could have pulled off a good match. And, indeed, The Rock did carry him.
Yeah,
And, in a rare show of, you know, I'm not going to use my political card, brother, Hogan did the job, which was absolutely the right thing to do.
of course it was. Of course it was. I mean, it would have been.
Now I wish he had that same attitude you know, when he fought Triple H for the Universal title, when he fought Shawn Michaels at SummerSlam, and then Randy Orton as well. But
Mm,
there you go. Can't have it all. But
yeah.
no.
So
Regardless
ultimately,
of what we might think of Hulk Hogan these days,
mm,
that was probably his last great match, I would say.
yeah. So ultimately, WrestleMania 17 is your favorite, and you think it's the greatest WrestleMania. I mean, look, I,
Oh,
I,
no, I should mention as well, obviously, WrestleMania 31 has a special meaning, significance for me, as it's the only WrestleMania I've had
yeah,
the privilege
of
of
course.
attending.
Um,
And in lifelong WCW fan,
mm,
it was surreal to finally see Sting
yeah,
at a WrestleMania, and indeed that was part of the reason why I was already in America at the time,
mm,
but that added extra incentive to actually go out to WrestleMania to see Sting
mm,
make his, notwithstanding, his Hall of Fame induction, his one and only only one and only appearance as an in-ring performer at WrestleMania.
yeah, um,
It's unfortunate he didn't get the result that I think he deserved, but enough
yeah.
from me. Over to you.
But yeah, I was gonna say about WrestleMania 17. A lot of people regard that as the greatest WrestleMania of all time, and I understand why. I've watched that WrestleMania many times over, and you're right, it did pretty much have everything. Um,
I
and
mean, people refer to it as wrestling perfection. It wasn't perfect in the sense that, as I said, ultimately the heel turn thing,
mm,
whilst it was intended to make Austin look weak, still the crowd cheered for him over The Rock.
yeah, um,
So
I yeah. I mean, if I was to say what I think is the greatest WrestleMania of all time, I would agree with WrestleMania 17. Um, but obviously, as I've said, my favorite is WrestleMania 25. Now, moving on from favorite and greatest WrestleManias, um, who in I mean, really, I'm going to ask this question, but really, realistically, in my opinion, there can only be one answer to this question. Of course, people are entitled to have their opinions, and I would never tell anybody that they're wrong for having an opinion. But of my opinion, there's only one answer to this question. Who is the greatest WrestleMania performer of all time?
this is a really difficult one
Is it really?
because it could be one of two people. Um,
Go on, who's the two people?
Well, the first is, of course, Mr. WrestleMania himself, Shawn Michaels,
Of
who
course.
made that event his
Yeah.
own. Effectively, I would argue that when he became big, that's when WrestleMania really consolidated itself as
Yeah.
the show of shows, as we call it, the
Yeah.
granddaddy of them all. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Hogan being involved made it big. You know, there were people before that, Bret Hart, Hogan, and all them. But,
No, I know what you
you
mean,
know,
though.
after they left, for WCW, and there was a clear void, there was no real big superstar left to, immediately left to fill their boots.
Mm.
Shawn Michaels rose through the ranks and he really made it his own. That's one. The other one, I think, without a shadow of a doubt, whenever you think of WrestleMania, you're always going to think of the Undertaker
Well, this is what I was going to say.
and that long streak, which, in my
Yeah.
honest opinion, it was the worst move to have him lose that streak. But
Yeah, it was. The thing is,
in retrospect, the way he came out of that match,
mm,
he was honestly in no fit state to even compete in that match in the first place.
mm,
To be honest,
um,
and I think it was a massive mistake
yeah,
on
I,
W part and everyone involved to have
yeah,
actually allowed him to take part.
yeah. No, I
If
agree.
they had known he wasn't fit to take part, I mean, they could have done it in certain ways where, I don't know, Lesnar could, he could have won. Undertaker could have won by disqualification or something, or um, or very rarely it happens, but they could have pulled him out of the match. They could have just cited something,
Yeah,
and then have Lesnar take
yeah,
on a different opponent.
yeah.
If they wanted to, they could have
Yeah,
made it work. It was a big mistake.
mm,
And
I,
also to this day, I maintain, were they going to break the streak, Lesnar was not the man to have done it.
well,
There were
this
three
is, cool.
there were three other wrestlers I would have put above that. Now, I genuinely believe, had they known that Sting was going to come to WWE a year later, they would have never ended the streak there and then. Now, that's not to say that they would have ended the streak against Sting. No, not at all. But they would have allowed the streak to carry on another year, because I think everybody wanted to see that match happen. And there was
Yeah,
absolutely no way that Undertaker was ever going to lose to Sting at a WrestleMania. Absolutely no way. That would have never happened.
no,
That's number one. Number two, I think the loss to Roman Reigns, had the Lesnar match not had that not happened, that would have been a better way to have ended the streak, given that it was the match that went last.
mm,
And it kind of fit the bill a bit more, this rise, this. I mean, he wasn't really a rising up and coming; he was already a main event star. But this was
yeah,
like the match that really consolidated him.
yeah. I mean, right.
It could have been a proper passing of the torch moment, because
Mm.
with Brock Lesnar, it wasn't a passing of the
No,
torch
it
moment.
wasn't. I mean, Brock was very much already cemented as a, pretty much a future Hall of Famer at that point.
No,
Uh,
but what I would say is that him beating the Undertaker's streak, in my honest opinion, consolidated Brock Lesnar as one of the greatest villains of all time.
yes, I do agree.
And even though he's portrayed as a face at the moment, for me, Brock Lesnar is and always will be a villain.
Yeah, the, the going back to the original question I asked about the greatest WrestleMania
Oh,
performer of all
sorry.
time.
1 second, 1 second. There's one person I forgot to mention who I think should have been considered to break the streak, and that was Bray Wyatt. Again,
Well,
in a
yeah,
sort of passing of the torch
yeah,
moment, from one creepy, mystical character to another.
yeah,
But unfortunately, they dropped the ball on that, and
yeah,
you know, it's gone, it's done, we've gotten used to it.
yeah.
It's That's the way it is. But no, back to you.
Um, I was going to say back to my original question, who's the greatest WrestleMania performer of all time? And I said there was only, for me, and it's only my opinion. I respect your opinion of mentioning Shawn Michaels. Of course, he needs to be mentioned in this conversation. But for me, when I said there was only one answer, it was the Undertaker. The Undertaker is synonymous with WrestleMania every year, especially once Undertaker sort of went to the point where he was only doing pretty much one match a year, which was at WrestleMania. Every year you looked forward to WrestleMania to see that streak, to see who was going to try and take it on next. Every year he would put on a great performance after great performance after great performance, apart from a few WrestleManias, but that was later on in his career where he didn't perform too well, and I'll get to them in a minute. He did put on amazing performances against some amazing opponents, the likes of Triple H, Shawn Michaels, Edge, Ric Flair, Randy Orton, just to name a few. I'm not going to name them all. But it's, going on to what you said about the streak, it was the wrong decision. Brock didn't need it. Brock, yes, okay, it cemented him as one of the greatest villains of all time. Yeah, okay, but he didn't need it in terms of, he didn't need it for a push. He didn't need it to get him the card or to cement him as a future star. He was already a star. He was already cemented as a future Hall of Famer. He didn't need it. It was just, and from what I've recently learned as well, not recently learned, but learned over the last sort of couple of years, was that the original end to that match was supposed to be Undertaker winning. And then when Undertaker and Brock got to the arena, Vince McMahon said, look, I want to change the end of this. I want to end the streak. He obviously asked the Undertaker first, because there was no way he was going to end the streak without clearing it with the Undertaker first. Even though Vince is the boss, because of respect and how loyal Undertaker's been, he had to clear with Undertaker first. So he went to Undertaker first. Undertaker said, yeah, okay, I'm willing to go along with that. He went to Brock. Brock said, no, I'm not doing it. Don't want to be the one to end the streak. Vince said, look, I want you to end the streak. I want you to do it. Come on. Mark has agreed to do it. Undertaker has agreed to do it. Come on, let's do it. End the streak. Brock was still like, I don't really want to do it, but if this is what we're doing, and if Mark is happy with it, then I'll go ahead with it. So Brock very clearly didn't want to be the one to end the streak. There's even a picture that has been taken of Brock Lesnar basically nearly in tears backstage watching Undertaker have his moment after their match at WrestleMania 30, because he really does want to be the one to end the streak. And it's, it's sad that, as the character Brock Lesnar, yeah, it cemented him as one of the greatest villains of all time, but as the person Brock Lesnar has to live with the fact that he's the one that ended that legendary streak. He has to live with the fact that that was the decision that was made, even though he really didn't want to do it. I would not want to live with that. If I really didn't want to do it, if I didn't want to do that, and if the person whose streak I ended was a really good friend of mine, I wouldn't want to live with that. That would be very hard to live with. But going back to Undertaker's performances over the WrestleManias, the two WrestleManias that stand out to me where he didn't perform that well, WrestleMania 33 against Roman Reigns and WrestleMania 30 against Brock Lesnar. Now, WrestleMania 31, you can sort of make excuses for Undertaker. He ended up getting a concussion really early on in that match. Anybody in that position, no matter how good you are in the ring, isn't going to be the same. You're not going to be able to perform to the same ability for him to be able to do as well as he actually did, which wasn't great but still decent, was amazing. He still managed to do choke slams, last rides, tombstones after having been concussed, which is amazing. So that stands out, but then he has got that excuse. WrestleMania 33, I mean, he said it himself in his documentary. He really wasn't happy with that performance. He looked tired. He looked He looked old, and he just didn't look like the Undertaker we knew and loved. And I thought when he put his boots in the middle of that ring, I thought, as much as it was sad, I thought, you know what, you're making the right decision here. This is the time. That match was just not good. You're showing that it is time to go. And in my opinion, maybe that should have been it. But he came back, had that 5 minute match with John Cena, which I was actually scrolling through TikTok yesterday or the day before, and funnily enough, a video came up about Undertaker talking about the match with John Cena, and at first he said to Vince, "Look, I'm in no state to come to WrestleMania this year. I can't perform against John Cena. I can't do it. Like, I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm not going to be able to get in shape quick enough." And Vince is like, "Come on, I really want you to do this against John Cena. It'll be a great match." So Undertaker got himself in shape, got to the arena, and Vince, because somebody had asked why the match was so short, because it was a short match, and Undertaker got to the arena, and Vince said the match is going to be 5 minutes, and Undertaker was like, no, I'm not going out there unless it's 30 minutes plus. So Undertaker goes from, I don't think I'll be fit enough, to wanting to put on a 30+ minute match with John Cena, which would have been epic, in fairness. Vince said, no, this is what we're going to do. John Cena's been talking smack about you. It makes sense for you to squash him. And that's what happened. I didn't really agree with it. I mean, we'd all been waiting for the John Cena Undertaker match at WrestleMania for years. We'd all been wanting it, and then it finally happened, and it was a 5 minute squash. I loved the Boneyard match against AJ Styles. I think it was the right decision for him to have that as his final match. I think he drove off into the sunset, and he hasn't wrestled since, and I think that's the perfect way for him to end his wrestling career. I don't think there's any need for him to come back. I think if he did, it would tarnish that great ending. A bit like Shawn Michaels coming back for that tag team match at Crown Jewel, it tarnished a great ending to his career that was against Undertaker at WrestleMania.
Look, I'm going to be absolutely honest with you. The Undertaker is never, never is a long time, but he's not coming back for another match, and I think we just need to accept that now.
Yeah, of course, and I'm happy about that.
Maybe they might do those scripted matches. I mean, I know Sting somehow has now got a 14-0 streak going on in AEW, but look, The Undertaker has done everything he could possibly do in wrestling, and he also has some well-documented medical issues. As a fan, I would rather not see him put himself through that again.
No.
He has even said himself he literally has to take painkillers just to get through a match and walk to the ring.
Yeah.
That is not somebody who is fit to wrestle a match.
No, it's not. So, podcast has been about 30 minutes long now. I don't like them to be much longer, but there's a few more things I want to discuss before we end. So, we've discussed our favourite WrestleManias. We've then discussed what we both think is the greatest WrestleMania, which is the same. We've now discussed who we think is the greatest performer in WrestleMania history. Let's move on to what we think is the greatest match in WrestleMania history. Let's start with you. You go ahead and tell me what you think the greatest match in WrestleMania history is. There's a lot to choose from, I know.
There is a lot to choose from,
but it's the one that sticks out.
I mean, for me personally, I really liked the Rock versus Hogan match, and again, apologies to anyone that might be offended by the mention of Hulk Hogan, and I just want to make very clear this is not me, celebrating or condoning Hulk Hogan in any way, shape, or form. It's well documented what his misdemeanors were, and we're not going to get into that. But from a match standpoint, from a standpoint in terms of the build-up, what it represented, this was basically WWE. I mean, it was wrong to suggest in the promo JR as The Rock as wrestling's future, because he wasn't really the future. He was already there. He was already at the top. I mean, ironically, after that, after the next year, he was gone, into Hollywood. This was basically just, you know, it was really like the passing of a torch moment sort of way. It was, the two greatest icons in wrestling history going one on one. This is a man who, after so many years of being away, working for the rival company, who affected to the point where it almost put the WWE out of business, was now back at WWE's flagship pay per view. Arguably, in a stadium arena where he was probably involved in one of the most memorable WrestleMania matches of all time against the Ultimate Warrior. Again, another controversial character, but that has to be mentioned. And for me, I just think that match was sheer brilliance. From what the build up to it, what happened in the ring, the crowd reaction, the back and forth. It was one of the great all time WrestleMania matches. So that's one. Another one I would have to say is Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 25. Generally, often regarded as one of the greatest matches of all time. Even the match the following year, whilst it wasn't as good as the one that happened at 25, because of the fact there was a lot riding on that and the story and the build up to that, it was almost like 25 and 26 were like a two-part story. It was like a two-part story. You know, it was something that just couldn't be settled at WrestleMania 25. It had to be settled in WrestleMania 26, and I think that moment, when Undertaker's telling Shawn Michaels to stay down, and he just basically, as a final fu to the Undertaker, slaps him in the face.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it was very much like the end of an era, that match, for both men. That was, in my honest opinion, both men's last great match. And had both men retired at that point, I don't think we would have ever batted an eyelid.
No.
Um, there are other matches I'm trying to think of, but it's not coming
I mean,
immediately to my mind right now. But
we could be here. We could be here all day discussing all the great matches at WrestleMania. But you've picked two good ones there, and I would have to pretty much agree with what you've said there. I've told you, one of the reasons why WrestleMania 25 is my favorite WrestleMania of all time is because of that match. There's more to it. Obviously, I liked everything about that WrestleMania, but that's one of the main reasons why I loved that WrestleMania. Um, I think that is without a doubt the greatest WrestleMania match of all time. I mean, it's renowned as one of the greatest matches of all time, not just greatest WrestleMania match of all time. So you have to. I think that's pretty much a given. But yeah, it was just a fantastic match, and then the match after at WrestleMania 26, from a storytelling point of view, it was a fantastic story building up to that match. Shawn's obsession with wanting to end the streak, couldn't get over the fact that he'd lost to the Undertaker the year before because he made a silly mistake. He said, if I hadn't made that mistake, I'd have ended the streak. The mistake he's talking about is obviously he did a moonsault from the top rope. Undertaker caught him in a tombstone position, and that's how the match ended. Um, he said, if I hadn't made that mistake, I would have beaten the streak. I would have ended the streak. I want another chance to end the streak because I won't make the same mistake again. And then he got obsessed because the Undertaker refused to have the match with him, and then yeah, he refused to have the match, and then the story all built up was Shawn Michaels somehow, trying to get into that match. I mean, the Royal Rumble match of the same year as WrestleMania 26 was a fantastic Royal Rumble. The story was there. Shawn Michaels is trying to stay in that Royal Rumble by any means necessary, trying to get that match with the Undertaker, because the Undertaker was the champion at that point. Um, and then yeah, I'm not going to go through the whole story because you all know what the story was, or at least you should know.
But I mean,
Uh,
when I think about it, a lot of matches that I'm thinking about, greatest WrestleMania matches seem to involve Undertaker or Shawn Michaels. I mean, there was Shawn
well,
Michaels
this
versus
is
at
this is,
WrestleMania 24. There was Edge versus Undertaker at
yeah.
WrestleMania
I mean,
24.
this is going back to saying who the greatest WrestleMania performer of all time is. You said Shawn Michaels and Undertaker. I mean, that is why
Batista and
a lot of the greatest
Undertaker at
uh,
WrestleMania
yeah,
23.
that's why a lot of the greatest matches are um, have them two in it. Um, but like I said, we could be here all day talking about all the greatest matches. There's
I mean, I am wary we haven't, without wishing to sound PC, but for the sake of diversity, we haven't mentioned any of the women's matches.
of course, and of course, I mean,
I mean, we
unfor-
have to give
unfor-
a special mention to the main event of WrestleMania 35, for the significance
yeah,
of
of
it. I
course, and
mean,
I was just about to mention that.
the ending to it was somewhat botched, in my
Yeah,
honest
oh,
opinion.
it was a massive botch.
It was a massive botch, in my honest opinion. I felt it was the wrong result. I wanted Ronda Rousey to come out of WrestleMania as the winner.
But it
Indeed, a bit like The Rock, she's never won a world title match at WrestleMania.
no, and the thing was, um, the thing with that match, and I was going to mention it because you said we hadn't mentioned the women in it. The thing is with the women's matches before I start talking about that main event. The thing is with the women's matches at WrestleMania, unfortunately, before sort of the current era of women's wrestling,
And of course,
it
before
wasn't treated as seriously. So a lot of the time, the women's belt wasn't even defended at WrestleMania. I mean, the Divas Championship, for instance, wasn't defended that much at WrestleMania. One of the only defenses I can think of that comes to mind is when Vicky Guerrero did that invitational match because she wanted to get the championship off AJ Lee. And the reason why that comes to mind is because I've watched that WrestleMania recently.
mm.
And
and of course, obviously to make a point, and again, this is not me. This is neither me nor you condoning what they used to do. Obviously, some of the women's matches were just seen as, fillers
of course,
on the
I mean,
card,
if
and
you, yeah,
often in a very degrading way as
yeah,
well.
of course. I mean, if you look back at the some of the earlier WrestleManias, so like between like, well, I don't even know what numbers to really say, but if you look back at some of the earlier ones, so before WrestleMania 20, at least, some of the segments the women were in weren't even in matches. Some of them were like pillow fights. Uh, they were in bikinis and all this stuff. They weren't treated seriously, and this is what I'm talking
Well,
about. Like,
this is it. I mean,
it's yeah,
this is why I'm also very critical of the Attitude Era, and to an extent, the earlier parts of the Ruthless Aggression Era, in the sense that everyone goes on about how the Attitude Era was so wonderful or whatever, but you go back and watch some of the elements of it, especially the way that the women's matches were treated and the female
yeah.
superstars. It was very cringe.
It was very cringe, and it's
It was very cringe, and like, look, it was almost like the television equivalent of like, you know, an overexcited schoolboy's dream.
yeah. I mean,
And
look,
it,
go on.
it's not something that I like to look back on positively,
No,
because yeah, there were some great superstars that came out of it, but like I said, things like bra and panties matches, skin to win matches, they're an aspect of, they were not women's wrestling. They were just, trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator, which
mm,
is, in McMahon's eyes, actually, I shouldn't say that, but in the WWE's eyes at the time, it was a case of, oh, sex sells.
yeah, of course. I mean,
Um,
ultimately, like, it was just, women's wrestling was not treated seriously back then. And like I said, the current era is only when women's wrestling has really been treated seriously. Because you can even say, like, the Divas Championship era, it wasn't really treated that seriously. Not until at least AJ Lee won the Divas Championship. Then it was sort of taken seriously because
no, well, even then, it was a case
AJ Lee
of
wanted
they weren't
AJ
they
Lee
weren't always,
wanted. Go on.
yeah. It was even a case of then there was still issues with referring to them as divas,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that is now very much a thing of the
It
past.
is.
And
But
indeed, a lot of the people who were the big stars of that era are now no longer really involved in the WWE.
no,
I
of
mean,
course.
obviously, you've just seen recently the Bellas have now left the WWE.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got Charlotte Flair still around, Natalia's still around, you've got Beth Phoenix still pops up every now and again.
Yeah, I mean, look,
But,
I truly believe that, and this is just my opinion, I truly believe that women's wrestling was started to be treated seriously when AJ Lee won that championship. Yes, they were still called divas, but her reign was a very serious reign because she wanted to be seen and as a woman's wrestler and not just somebody to look at. She said it in she said it in quite a few of her promos, and then she did that famous AJ Lee pipe bomb promo where she had to go at all the women from that sort of era, the Bellas, Natalia, all these different women, having to go at them for just playing up to the crowd, and wanting to be looked at instead of being treated seriously and stuff like that, and you know, and then obviously, of course, when Paige came to the main roster and dethroned AJ Lee, it very much was that was the turning point then because Paige was completely different from any diva we'd seen before because she wasn't a diva. She was a wrestler. She was a woman's wrestler, and she didn't look like any diva we'd seen before, looks wise. She wasn't blonde with big boobs. You know what I mean? She was this gothic-looking girl who turned out to be, in my opinion, one of the greatest women's wrestlers I've ever seen. It was a shame that she had to retire from WWE and WWE wouldn't clear her, so now she's gone to AEW. But that's getting off topic. I think I think that was when it was really started treated seriously, and that's why we've not got a lot of women's matches to really choose from when we talk about great women's matches at WrestleMania. It's difficult. I mean, the last few years, I mean, I would say Sasha versus Bianca a couple of years ago, I think that was now. That was a fantastic match. And then you've got that main event match. It was a great match up until that botched ending. Becky was supposed to make Charlotte tap out, and somehow whether it was Ronda's fault, whether it was Becky's fault, somehow that it got botched, and Ronda's shoulders ended up being on the mat for the three. Um, but yeah, that's why there's not really a lot we can say about the women's wrestling when it comes to WrestleMania. I will do an episode dedicated to women's wrestling, 100%, so we can go more in depth about women's wrestling because it's only fair. So we'll move on from that. Last couple of things I want to discuss. One thing is greatest moment at WrestleMania. Now, when I mean moment, I don't necessarily mean a match. It could be a championship win. It could be just a moment. Not necessarily
you
a match.
mean by greatest? Do you mean like that gave people a positive feeling, or greatest as in the most memorable or significant
Most
moment?
memorable.
Because again, there is only one that stands out above all of them, which was the ending of the streak.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the ending of the streak. It's very, very easy to answer this one. End of the streak was probably the most memorable moment. I remember clearly. I remember clearly watching WrestleMania 30. I remember watching it. I was actually in this bedroom I'm in now, lying on that bed, watching it live, and I remember I was texting a mate while I was watching the Undertaker Brock Lesnar match, and I remember when Undertaker got hit with that third F5, and I looked down at my phone, um, just as Brock hit the F5, expecting Undertaker to kick out, and I was texting my mate, and then I looked up as it got to 2. I was like, oh, here we go, he's going to kick out, and then it went to 3. I was like, the fuck? And then the mate I was texting was also sort of interested in wrestling, and I messaged him. I was like, "You're never gonna believe it. Undertaker's streak's just ended."
No, I remember where I was. I remember.
And it was just such a shocking moment. Like I don't think I've been that shocked that with anything WWE have done since that moment. And next year it'll have been 10 years ago. So it's just yeah. I I'll let you talk about it for a second before I mention what I want to mention next.
No, I think you said everything about it, and we mentioned it a lot earlier. It was a shocking moment. I remember clearly where I was watching it. I was back at uni. I was in my room. Up till the early hours. It was starting to get a bit lighter. I remember watching it. And I remember even talking about it with some of my other students. When I went in the next day, and they weren't wrestling fans, but they knew about it because it was covered in BBC News. So that's how significant it was.
Yeah.
This was, you know, it was a significant moment in WrestleMania history,
Yeah.
and I think the only thing that really saved that WrestleMania ultimate, I don't think that WrestleMania was a disaster for it, not at all. But the only thing that kind of deflected away from it was ultimately Daniel Bryan's win at the end,
Yeah.
which you could argue is one of the greatest WrestleMania moments
Yeah.
as well. Um,
I
you
think.
know, but just to kind of deflect away from that, you know, if we're to look at other significant moments, Shawn Michaels winning against Bret Hart, after the Iron Man match. I mean, the Iron Man match itself isn't really a classic, but that moment, as people say, the boyhood dream
Yeah.
realized. Macho Man reuniting with Miss Elizabeth.
I mean, look,
Um,
there's,
Again, Hulk Hogan body slamming Andre.
yeah,
Ultimate Warrior beating Hulk Hogan, to win that title, and for the first
yeah,
time, truly seeing Hulk Hogan defeated on the big stage.
mm,
That was significant.
it was,
Obviously, the first ever WrestleMania, that was always a
yeah.
significant moment.
Look, we could go, like
Um,
I said, like it's the same with the matches. We could go on and on about the moments and stuff like that. But I feel there's one moment that we need to mention, and it will never be renowned or celebrated anymore because of certain things. But
well,
I feel
before we
I
get to that moment, I mean, another one that I would mention is obviously Seth Rollins cashing in his Money in the Bank briefcase and winning the title 30. Obviously the
yeah,
first time that ever
I mean
happened,
that's the greatest cash in of all time.
and completely spun the main event on its
Yeah,
head, and it was probably a moment none of us ever saw coming. Given that he lost quite comprehensively earlier in the
yeah,
evening.
right, right,
I think Sting making his debut at WrestleMania, that is a significant moment as well. And
yeah,
although it's not the way I would have played out the match, but seeing him, seeing DX, seeing the NWO all come out and all of them standing in the
mm,
ring, it was almost like two worlds colliding. The WCW
yeah,
and the WWE Monday Night Wars
yeah,
coming to a very final end,
mm,
and indeed, the women main eventing WrestleMania 35.
yeah,
That was
yeah.
a significant moment,
Of course
and
it was. Yeah.
yeah, I'll let you mention. I know you're itching to mention it, so I'll let you mention it.
So yeah, the moment I'm talking about, and regardless as to your feelings of one of the people involved, I think you have to say that it was an amazing moment, and
I mean, maybe
I
we can mention the moment without having to mention the man's name if we
well,
unless we
here's the
really
thing.
need
My
to.
my podcast is about not being afraid to talk about anything. I've always said that. I've said this from the start. So I'm not going to start being afraid to mention things now. Um, of course, I mean, I think everybody's probably figured out what moment I'm talking about now because I'm sort of delaying actually saying what it is. Um, of course, it's got to be the ending of WrestleMania 20 between Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit. And the reason, obviously, that it will never be celebrated is because of what Chris Benoit did, which I'm not going to get into because I've already done a podcast about all of that, so there's no need to get into that at all. But it was what an amazing moment it was. I mean, two friends who were never thought they would get to the top of any company because of their size and their stature, and were always told that, coming up through the ranks, that they would never get to the top because of their size and their stature. Finally, get to the top of the WWE at the same time, and they were the best of friends, and then that massive hug with all that confetti at the end. It was a great moment, and it will never ever be celebrated. I mean, you can watch it on the network, you can still see it on the network if you want to watch it. um, and I would recommend watching WrestleMania 20 because it is a good WrestleMania. But yeah, what a moment it was. It won't be celebrated, understandably so. But I felt it would be wrong of me not to mention that moment when we're talking about greatest moments. Even though it is a controversial thing to talk about because of one of the people involved, I think um, I think it had to be mentioned. I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm not going to keep going on about it because I don't think we should. Even though I'm not afraid to talk about it, and this podcast is about talking about anything and everything and not being afraid to mention anything. I don't want to dwell on it because there could be people out there that could get offended. I apologise if anybody has been offended by the mention of Chris Benoit. It was not, intended to offend anyone. But you should know what my podcast is all about these days, and you should know what my podcast is all about at this point. This is the third episode. You should know that I'm not afraid to mention anything. Um, so if you are easily offended, you shouldn't really be watching. But I do apologise if anybody is watching that does get offended. But we're going to move on from that now, and we're going to move on from the greatest moments. Unless you want to mention anything about that moment I just said. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, continue.
Is there anything you want to say about the moment I just mentioned?
No, I think you've summed it up. I think, look, let's just go back to that moment in time when whatever happened afterwards was, we didn't know about. It was obviously a great moment for both men. Now, to be absolutely clear, I in no way, shape, or form endorse Chris Benoit. I think
No.
we know very much what he did. We're not going to go into whether or not he was. I mean, he was guilty. That is that is a
Yeah,
fact.
like I said, I've
We're
done a
not here to
podcast
we are not
episode.
here to discuss
I've done
that.
a podcast episode about all that, so we don't need to get
My
into it.
personal opinion was that whilst I regarded him as one of the greatest technical wrestlers of all time, he put on great matches. I was personally never a huge fan of his, and certainly not a huge fan of his on the mic. Now, his story fitted in well at the time. I think it was a great moment for, as you said, two of wrestling's greatest underdog stories to close out, the show with that moment. Um, and obviously, it's tragic that just a year later, Eddie Guerrero was gone.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, that's all really I can say about that.
But yeah, like I said,
It's just one of those things that if you want to watch it, the footage is out there. It's all out there. Obviously, I think people have to accept it's never going to be celebrated
no,
in that way ever again.
I
If
I
people want to appreciate it in their own way, that's up to them. But I think also people need to understand why it will never be celebrated. And
yeah,
I
I
think most wrestling fans are okay with that.
yeah, I think so. I think most people are, and I think everyone knows why it will never be celebrated. But like I said, I just thought we were talking about greatest moments. I thought it would have been criminal not to mention it. That's a wrong choice of words. Um, I think it would have been wrong not. Jesus Christ. I think it
Well,
would have been.
let me put it a different way to
I
you.
think it'd have been
Let me put it
wrong not to
let,
mention
let,
it.
let me put it a different way. By raising that moment, you're also kind of erasing Eddie Guerrero's moment.
I mean, this is the thing.
That's the way I would look at it.
It's such a difficult one because WrestleMania 20 was huge for Eddie Guerrero as well. His underdog story was just as significant as Benoit's. To erase that also erases Eddie Guerrero's moment, but I suppose it's a case of it's a necessity because Chris Benoit is too much associated with that moment, and it's sad but it's the truth. But anyway, I want to move on from talking about Chris Benoit now and that moment. Apologies for anybody who got offended by talking about that, but I will this podcast, and I will say this one last time, is about not being scared to talk about anything, and we talk about anything and everything on this podcast. There is no
I was going to say,
nothing.
if we didn't mention it, we would be doing a disservice to Eddie
Yeah,
Guerrero.
exactly. I think, and basically, pretty much nothing is off limits. Obviously, there is a limit. Even though I said there is no limits, obviously to a point there has to be, but um, pretty much nothing is off limits. Anyway, moving on. The podcast's been nearly an hour long now, so we are going to wrap this up. This has been the longest episode, but we're not going to wrap up and end on talking about Chris Benoit, because I think that would be not the best of endings, to be honest. So I want to end on talking about WrestleMania stages. Now, before we get to our opinions on what we think is, the greatest stages and stuff like that, let's view again this year's stage. Now, I've managed to find an image this time instead of a video. I've managed to find a still image of the stage for this year. I showed it during the stream yesterday that I did of SmackDown and the Hall of Fame. But if you missed that because you didn't know I was on live on Twitch, basically all my streams, watch-alongs, are going to be on my Twitch. So go to my Twitch. It is TomBurnz, all one word. Basically the same as what my YouTube channel is, but instead it's all one word. You'll find me on there. That's where I'll be doing all my watch-alongs, so don't miss them. But anyway, yeah, so yesterday I did technically it was today because it was early hours of the morning. I did a SmackDown Hall of Fame watch-along, and I showed the stage during that stream. And I'm going to show it again now. Here we go. Oh, hang on. That was a fail. Here we go. So you can see it. It's in front of my face, but that's fine. There is the WrestleMania 39 stage. Now, in my opinion, that is one of the best stages I think I've ever seen. I wouldn't say it's the greatest, but I would say it's one of the best that I've ever seen. And I knew they'd go all out with it being a WrestleMania in Hollywood. I knew they wouldn't go halves on a stage for WrestleMania Hollywood. But wow, it looks absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. Let's get that out of my face again now. So moving on from that, greatest WrestleMania stages. Now I'm going to start off with this, and I'm going to say it's a difficult one because there's been a fair few decent stages at WrestleMania history, but I would like to say, apart from this one this year, WrestleMania 39, I've been sort of disappointed with every single stage from WrestleMania 30 onwards. Now you could say that's controversial because maybe you disagree. I would actually I take that back. Last year's stage, WrestleMania 38 stage, was fantastic. I really liked that. But apart from that, from 30 to 37, I was relatively disappointed compared to what the stages used to be like before WrestleMania 30. Relatively disappointing. I would say my favourite WrestleMania stage of all time. Now, obviously, I haven't watched a lot of the earlier WrestleManias, but I assume that the early WrestleManias, like from like 1 to like 10, there wasn't much of a stage because there wasn't as much technology back then. So I would say, obviously, from obviously a wrestling standpoint, I probably missed out, but stage-wise, I've probably not missed out. It's a difficult one. I would say my favourite WrestleMania stage has got to be, I absolutely loved WrestleMania 24's stage. I thought it was absolutely epic. And then I remember one particular moment at WrestleMania 24 when Ric Flair came out, when he was having his retirement match. Well, retirement match in quotation marks.
And the fireworks.
And he did the same thing that Charlotte does to this day. Gets his jacket and he twirls around. Or no, not gets his jacket. He puts his arms out and he goes around. And the fireworks around the stage was absolutely amazing. And that to me is the one moment where I thought, you know what? Wow, this stage is absolutely like first class amazing. But yeah, that's just my opinion. That's one of my favorite WrestleMania stages. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean it's difficult for me to kind of argue against those. I would go as far as even saying that probably, tonight's WrestleMania set may well be the best one.
Well, this is what I said. It's one of the greatest I've seen.
I mean, I hate to say this. It's going to sound bizarre, absolutely bizarre saying this. I've never always really given the set too much thought. I mean, it's great. It adds to it. But, for me, it's always been about the match.
Of course.
But, WrestleMania 20 set was pretty good. Um, that's about it, really.
Hmm.
As I said, it's not something I've overly thought of too much.
Well, there we go. Um, well, there we are. I don't think there's much else to discuss here on this WrestleMania podcast. It's been a lot longer than I was imagining it was going to be. But when it comes to WrestleMania, there's so many WrestleManias that have happened. You sort of have to go in depth with the discussions and stuff like that. So I don't mind that this one's gone a bit longer. It is WrestleMania. It's the biggest wrestling show in the world. It deserves a bit of a longer podcast than the others. Um, but yeah, anyway, I hope that you enjoyed the podcast. Thank you to Brahma for joining me for today's podcast. Um, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to us talk about our favourite WrestleMania moments and all our favourite, WrestleMania matches and all that stuff. I hope you enjoyed listening to us go on and on about it. um, but yeah, I'll be back for episode 4 of my podcast. Not sure when, probably in a couple of weeks. Don't know what the subject of that podcast is going to be about yet. I might do what I said I was going to do and do episode 4 all about women's wrestling. I might do that. In fact, that's probably what it is going to be about. I'm going to do some research into early women's wrestling because I don't know a lot about it. And yeah, we can discuss that on the next episode. As I said, I don't know when it will be, probably in a couple of weeks, but I'm not 100% sure yet. But I'll put it in the community tab on this channel anyway, so keep an eye out for that. And don't forget to follow me on Twitch and join me for the WrestleMania Night 1 watch along here tonight. I'll be starting, I want to say around about 11ish because that's when the pre-show starts, but I'm not bothered about starting bang on 11 because the pre-show, let's be honest, is all going to just be talking. There's not going to be any matches. So I'm not overly bothered about watching the pre-show, but I will watch some of it. Plus, I want to do my own sort of little pre-show because I want to talk about the predictions and stuff like that. Anyway, so yeah, I shall see you over on Twitch later on tonight between 11 and 12 for the WrestleMania Night 1 watch along. Thank you for joining us for the podcast today, and I'll see you for the next episode very soon. Bye bye.
Stream ended.